There is a dream that has haunted every civilization that has ever existed. It goes something like this. What if we started over? What if we swept away the accumulated debris of centuries, the old hierarchies, the inherited privileges, the dusty creeds, the half remembered customs, and rebuilt everything from scratch? What if we took human reason, pure and uncorrupted, and simply designed a better world? No more muddle, no more compromise, no more bowing to the dead weight of the past. Just clarity, principle, and the bright promise of a future made whole. It is an intoxicating dream, and it is, perhaps, the most dangerous idea in the history of politics. In 1789, France decided to try it. What began as a reasonable demand for fiscal reform and constitutional limits on royal power rapidly, almost incomprehensibly, became something else entirely. By 1792, the king was under arrest. By 1793, he was dead. By 1794, the Committee of Public Safety had guillotined not just the enemies of the revolution, but the revolution's own children. The Girondins, the moderates, the men who had lit the fire and were now astonished to discover they could not control it. Thousands executed, churches shuttered, the calendar itself abolished and replaced, because even time was contaminated by the old order and had to be started fresh. The revolutionaries called it the Republic of Virtue. Their contemporaries called it the Terror. Across the channel, in the quiet of his study, a 60-year-old Anglo Irish statesman watched all of this and understood, before almost anyone else, exactly what it meant. His name was Edmund Burke, and in 1790, before the worst of the killing had even begun, he sat down and wrote the single most important work of conservative political philosophy ever produced. He titled it Reflections on the Revolution of France, and he warned with almost prophetic precision of everything that was about to happen. But Burke was not just writing about France. He was writing about us, about every society and every age that would face the same temptation, the seduction of the clean slate, the promise of the revolutionary moment. He was writing about the permanent human drama between those who would tear down and those who would preserve, between the revolutionary and the conservative, between the dream of perfection and the discipline of civilization. And if you look around at America today, at the culture wars, the institutional distrust, the ideological fever on both the left and right, you will find that Burke's argument is not a relic. It is the most urgent political document of our time. To understand Burke's counter revolutionary vision, you first have to understand what exactly he was opposing. And it wasn't simply violence. It wasn't even simply radicalism. Burke was opposing an idea. The French revolutionaries believed, sincerely, passionately, and with complete intellectual conviction, that they had discovered the universal laws of human society, the rights of man, self evident truths derived from pure reason applicable to all people in all times and in all places. They were not tinkering with France. They were implementing the permanent moral architecture of the human race. History, in their view, had been one long crime, one long history of superstition, exploitation, and arbitrary power. The revolution was the moment history finally came to its senses. This was not cynicism, it was fanaticism of the highest intellectual order. The men who made the French Revolution were not thugs. Many of them were lawyers, writers, philosophers, educated, sophisticated, and sincere. Robespierre was a brilliant lawyer who had once campaigned against the death penalty. He later used the guillotine with industrial efficiency. St. Just was 26 years old and wrote poetry. He helped design the machinery of mass murder with the calm certainty of a man who knows he is serving history itself. That certainty is what Burke saw, and it terrified him. Because when you believe that you are implementing a universal moral law, when you believe that your principles are not merely your opinions, but the permanent truths of human nature, then every obstacle to those principles becomes not just wrong, but evil. Every institution that resists becomes not merely conservative, but corrupt. Every person who hesitates becomes not merely cautious, but a traitor to humanity. And at that point, Burke saw there is no natural limit to what the revolutionaries will do. The terror was not an aberration, it was a logical conclusion. When you combine absolute certainty about your principles with unlimited political power, you get exactly what France got: the scaffold and the pit. Burke's insight, and this is the core of everything, was that the danger was not primarily in the violence. The violence was a symptom. The disease was the revolutionary mindset, the arrogant belief that a single generation can wipe the slate clean and redesign society from first principles. We are afraid to put men to live and trade each on his own private stock of reason, Burke wrote, because we suspect that this stock in each man is small, and that the individuals would do better to avail themselves of the general bank and capital of nations and of ages. That is the Burkean counter revolutionary argument in one sentence, and it is as relevant today as the day it was written. So, what did Burke offer in place of revolution? What is the right wing antidote? It is not, as his critics then and now have charged, mere reaction. It is not nostalgia for a golden age that never existed. It is not the defense of every existing institution simply because it exists. Burke himself supported American independence. He argued passionately for reform of British rule in India. He was not opposed to change. He was opposed to a kind of change, a pace of change, a spirit of change. And in place of the revolutionary spirit, he offered five pillars of counter revolutionary thought that together constitute the most coherent alternative to utopian politics ever formulated. The first pillar: prescription. Burke argued that the most legitimate rights and liberties are not the ones derived from abstract philosophy, but the ones that have been lived, the ones inherited from ancestors, confirmed by long experience, and transmitted through the generations. Rights that have been prescribed by history have something that abstract rights can never have: proof. They have been tested. They work. This is why Burke was so contemptuous of the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Not because he was indifferent to human liberty, he was one of the great champions of liberty in the British Parliament, but because he understood that a right announced in a pamphlet and a right embedded in centuries of constitutional practice are two entirely different things. The French revolutionaries had declaration. The English had Magna Carta, the common law, the glorious revolution. Imperfect, messy, accretive, but real. The English rights had been hammered out in actual conflicts between actual human beings and refined across generations. The French rights had been reasoned out in salons. One set of rights survived the revolution, the other produced it. The second pillar: prejudice. This is Burke's most misunderstood concept, and it is important to understand it precisely because prejudice, in Burke's sense, doesn't mean bigotry. It means something far more sophisticated. Burke argued that the accumulated customs, habits, manners, and moral intuitions of a society are not irrational. They are, in fact, a form of stored wisdom, wisdom that no single generation could consciously generate on its own. When a society has, over centuries, developed certain habits of behavior, certain ways of organizing family life, certain expectations about property, certain instincts about justice. Those habits encode information. They encode what works. They encode the lessons of 1,000 crises, 1,000 failures, 1,000 experiments, most of which have been forgotten by everyone alive. The revolutionary intellectuals, in their pride, looked at these habits and saw superstition. Burke looked at them and saw a library. Prejudice, he wrote, renders a man's virtue his habit, and not a series of unconnected acts. Through this prejudice, his duty becomes a part of his nature. A society that destroys its inherited moral habits in the name of reason is not liberating itself, it is amputating its own memory. The third pillar, gradualism. For Burke, the difference between reform and revolution was the difference between surgery and amputation. Both address pathology, but one preserves the patient. Burke did not deny that societies need to change. He insisted on it. But he insisted that change must be slow, tested, and reversible, made not by grand philosophical design, but by attending carefully to actual problems and finding practical solutions that disturb as little as possible of what works. This is because complex social systems, economies, legal traditions, cultural norms, religious institutions, have properties that their designers never intended and that no one fully understands. They are, in a term that would not exist for another 2 centuries, emergent. Their value often lies precisely in the features that seem to one rational reformer most arbitrary and most ripe for elimination. The French revolutionaries, in abolishing the Catholic Church, thought they were removing an instrument of oppression. They were actually destroying the primary institution that educated children, cared for the sick, fed the poor, and organized community life in virtually every village in France. The horror that followed was not an accident. It was what happens when you tear out the load bearing wall because you don't realize it's load bearing. The fourth pillar, the partnership of the generations. This is perhaps Burke's most poetic and most profound contribution to political thought. Society, he argued, is not a contract between the living. It is a contract between the living, the dead, and the unborn. The living did not create the civilization they inhabit. They inherited it, the legal systems, the accumulated capital, the cultural forms, the moral traditions, from generations of ancestors who built it at enormous cost, who suffered and sacrificed for it, who refined it through long experience. The living have the use of this inheritance, but they do not own it outright. They are stewards. Their obligation is to pass it on, improved where impossible, but above all, intact to those who will come after. This conception of political life is almost incomprehensible to the revolutionary mind. The revolutionary thinks in years, sometimes months. Burke thought in centuries. The revolutionary asks, what can we build? Burke asks, what has been given and what do we owe to those who gave it? The fifth pillar, prudence as the highest virtue. Against the revolutionary worship of abstract principle, Burke offered a very different political virtue, prudence. Not cowardice, not timidity, not the refusal to act, but the disciplined instances that political action must always be governed by a realistic assessment of circumstances, consequences, and human nature as it actually is, not as we wish it were. The great political sin for Burke was not wickedness, it was hubris. It was the prideful certainty that you understood enough about human society, its complexity, its fragility, its innumerable dependencies, to redesign it from scratch. That certainty has, across history, produced more suffering than any amount of ordinary wickedness. The ordinary tyrant is limited by his greed and his laziness. The ideological revolutionary is unlimited because he is serving a principle. Prudence is the conservative's bulwark against ideology. It says, you do not know enough. No one knows enough. Proceed carefully, and when in doubt, don't. But Burke's argument goes deeper than political philosophy. He understood something that most of his contemporaries did not, that revolution is not merely a political event, it is a psychological one. Revolutions do not begin in the streets, they begin in the mind. And the revolutionary mind, Burke observed, has a distinctive moral psychology, one that is, in its way, genuinely admirable and genuinely catastrophic. The revolutionary is motivated by a real perception of injustice. He sees suffering, inequality, hypocrisy, corruption, and he is right to see it. No society is without these things. The question is what you do with the perception. The prudent reformer sees injustice and asks, how can I address this specific problem without making things worse? The revolutionary sees injustice and concludes, the system itself is corrupt. The system must be destroyed. This shift from problem to system, from specific to total, is the crucial psychological moment. Once you have made it, everything changes. Every institution becomes a symbol of the corruption. Every person who defends any part of the existing order becomes a collaborator. Every compromise becomes a betrayal of the principle. And here Burke identified the terrible engine that drives revolutions past their original intentions: envy. Not the simple envy of the poor for the rich, that is too crude an account. Burke means a deeper moral emotion, the sense that the existing order is not merely unequal, but illegitimate, that the distinctions it maintains of rank, wealth, education, of cultural authority are not merely inconvenient but offensive to human dignity itself. Once you have concluded that all existing hierarchy is merely disguised oppression, you have made the revolutionary leap, because then every act of leveling is an act of justice. Every destruction of an existing institution is liberation. The more radical you are, the more virtuous you feel. This is the intoxicating quality of revolutionary politics, and it explains why it so reliably devours its own. Because the logic of total critique has no natural stopping point. There is always someone who has not leveled enough, has not purged enough, has not been revolutionary enough. Robespierre sent his rivals to the guillotine with the righteous confidence of a man purging corruption. He was sent to the guillotine 6 weeks later by men who judged him insufficiently pure. Burke saw all of this coming. He saw it because he understood that when you replace prudence with ideology, when you replace the discipline of institutional life with the ecstasy of the revolutionary purpose, you have not created a new morality. You have removed the only constraints that make political life tolerable. In the groves of their own academy, Burke wrote of the French philosophies, at the end of every visto you see nothing but the gallows. He was not being rhetorical, he was being prophetic. Look at America today. The revolutionary spirit, the conviction that existing institutions are not merely imperfect, but fundamentally corrupt, that the past must be erased rather than reformed, and that any half measure is complicity, is not confined to a particular political movement. It is a reoccurring temptation, and right now it is very much alive. On the left, the revolutionary impulse takes familiar Burkean forms, the demand that institutions be dismantled, not reformed, because they were built by people whose moral standing has been retroactively revoked. The instances that cultural inheritance itself is suspect, that the accumulated literary, philosophical, and artistic traditions of Western civilization are primarily instruments of oppression. The DEI revolution in universities and corporations, the rapid transformation of K 12 education along ideological lines, the contempt for procedural norms and institutional tradition in the name of advancing the cause. The certainty that the speed and totality of change is itself a moral virtue, that anyone who counsels patience or caution is simply defending power. Burke would have recognized every element of this. He saw it in Paris in 1789. But Burke's warning was never addressed only to the left. This is the point that most contemporary readers miss. Burke's Reflections is not a partisan document. It is a document about a mode of politics, a way of engaging with society that can infect any movement, any party, and any ideological tendency. And if Burke were alive today, he would have a sharp word for significant portions of the American right as well. Because the counter revolutionary impulse, the impulse to preserve, to maintain, to transmit civilization intact, can itself be corrupted. It can curdle into something else, into a nihilistic anti institutionalism that tears down without building, into a populist rage that destroys the very norms and structures conservatism exists to protect. Burke warned that the danger was not just in the left wing revolutionary, it was in the counter revolutionary, who, in his fury to defeat the revolution, adopted the revolution's methods, who replaced prudence with passion, who answered the enemy's contempt for institutions with his own contempt for institutions, only different ones. If you are burning down institutions in order to save civilization, Burke would ask you very gently to consider whether you have thought that through. The Burkean right is not the loudest right. It is not the most exciting right. It does not promise clean slates or glorious victories or the satisfaction of total war against the enemy. It promises something humbler and harder, the disciplined work of preservation, the patient labor of reform, and the thankless duty of handing on to the next generation something worth having. There is a paradox at the heart of Burke's counter revolutionary doctrine that is worth sitting with. Burke believed, and this is the most subversive claim, that the true conservative is the real revolutionary, not in the sense that he seeks to overturn the existing order, in a different and deeper sense. The conservative is a revolutionary because he understands just how rare and fragile ordered liberty actually is. He knows that the civilization he is defending did not arise naturally or inevitably. It was built, at enormous cost, over centuries, by people who had no guarantee it would survive. It survived not because it was with the natural state of things, but because generation after generation made the deliberate choice to maintain it, to defend it, and to transmit it. The revolutionary looks at civilization and sees what is wrong with it. The conservative looks at civilization and is astonished that it exists at all. Because if you understand what civilization is, if you understand what it took to create rule of law, independent courts, free speech, property rights, limited government, the separation of powers, then you understand that these things are not the default condition of human societies. They are extraordinary achievements. They are fragile, and they can be lost. And they are lost, Burke tells us, not primarily through the schemes of tyrants, but through the carelessness of people who inherit them, through the revolutionary impatience of those who, finding civilization imperfect, conclude that imperfection is corruption and corruption is reason enough to burn it down. This is why Burke called civilization the hard won inheritance of countless generations, not as a rhetorical flourish, but as a literal truth. Every institution you inhabit, every right you exercise, every protection you enjoy, every procedure that prevents arbitrary power from crushing you was purchased at a price. Someone fought for it, someone died for it. Someone endured long struggles and bitter compromise to build it into the structure of political life. You didn't earn it, you inherited it, and your obligation is to earn the right to have received it by passing it on. Society is indeed a contract, Burke wrote, but it is not a partnership agreement in a trade of pepper and coffee, calico or tobacco, or some other such low concern to be taken up for a little temporary interest and to be dissolved by the fancy of the parties. It is a partnership between the dead, the living and the unborn, a partnership in all science, a partnership in all art, a partnership in every virtue, and in all perfection. To break that partnership, to declare that this generation has the right to consume the inheritance without passing it on, to remake from scratch what centuries have built, is not liberation. It is the deepest form of ingratitude, and it is, Burke insists, the deepest form of political irresponsibility. We live right now in an age of revolutionary temptation. On the left, the dream of a clean slate, remake the culture, the curriculum, the institutions, the language itself, and the image of an abstract justice that no existing society has ever achieved and no future society can guarantee. Tear down what is because it is not what ought to be. On the right, the temptation of populist anti institutionalism, burn down the establishment, the administrative state, the credentialed class, the deep state, the coastal elite, let it all come down, and something better will emerge from the rubble. Both of these impulses share, beneath their apparent opposition, the same Burkean error. Both substitute passion for prudence. Both treat the existing structure of civilization as an obstacle rather than an inheritance. Both are more interested in destroying enemies than in maintaining the conditions that make civilization possible. And Burke says to both of them, wait. Not forever, not out of cowardice, not out of indifference to injustice, but wait, think. Consider what you might destroy that you cannot rebuild. Consider that complexity you do not understand may be work you cannot see. Consider that the generation that tears down rarely gets to control what is built in its place. The right's historic role, the role Burke assigns it and that history repeatedly confirms, is not to accelerate that destruction. It is not to be the revolutionary opposition of the establishment, the anti institutional party, the scorched earth faction. It is to stand athwart the revolutionary moment and shout, not so fast, not like this, not without understanding what we might lose. Civilization is not a disposable prototype. It is the hard won inheritance of countless generations, purchased at a price that can barely be calculated, and our duty, our solemn, unglamorous, unheroic duty, is to hand it on, improved where we can, but above all, intact.